Thanks for making the long trip into the middle of nowhere. And first of all, really, again, a huge, great thanks to Tim Voss and his team for making it happen. Also, I think there's the Stiftung Niedersachsen, the Landschaftsverbund Stadl, and the Kulturstiftung Nord-LB, and the municipality of Worpswede, which have supported this really kind of unusual and special event, the next 3 days that we're gonna spend together. I'm really, really happy also to welcome our speakers, Anselm Franke, Bracha Ettinger, and also Helen Hester and Diane Bauer, who are on their way, I believe, and Melanie Bonayo, who's also gonna join us. This symposium is following on from Worpswede Spekulationen 1 or 1, Psychomaterialism, which was convened by Tim Voss and Kerstin Starkemeyer, and that happened in 2014, and that aimed to really re-politicize notions of materialism, focusing on divergent discussions around that subject on the basis of a point of intersection, and that was the materialities of the riven subject in times of crisis, and subjective and psychopathological side of the materialist equation therein. So this symposium kind of is not a direct kind of picking up from where psychomaterialism left us, but it sort of follows on in that trajectory, and it is also really concerned with, I guess, still the psycho side, while also remaining committed to attention to matter and undead and non-human and otherwise sentient matters. It remains committed also, like the previous symposium, to a sort of more experimental and open-ended structure. So the idea is really to bring together practitioners, artists, and theorists, and also people who might still are in art education or have recently just left. We're all trying to figure out something together here, and that's the purpose of the weekend. So basically, also me, Anke, and Sam are in that situation. We came together from very, very, not very, very different directions. Sam is an artist, a writer, and a curator, and also the director of the Trignac project, which is an independent art space in the south of France that he runs together with Liz Murray. And he's really got a practice of also collaborating with other artists, architects, researchers, and developing new institutional models, which are both kind of real and speculative. So to give you some examples, he's co-founded the AESD, the Agency for Economical and Space Development, which is an architectural think tank with Shaheen Afrasiabi. And he's co-editing Madame Wang, a journal for geographically distributed collaboration. So Anke, actually, on the other hand, is a theorist of 21st century literature and visual culture. She's currently a visiting professor for media at the University of the Arts Berlin, and she's also teaching at St. Martin's University of the Arts in London. She's chairing the international research group Retroformalism, and she's a co-founder of the transnational research platform Speculative Poetics. She's also the author of Soviet Cinema Dramaturgy, and in cooperation with Armen Avesayan, the co-author of Present Tense Poetics and Metanoia, Speculative Ontology of Language. So really coming from probably the most scholarly among us, coming more from a direction of literature. I'm a filmmaker, artist filmmaker, I guess. And my films draw on factual, literary, and pop cultural sources. I deal with materiality and narrativity and their share in the formation or deformation of subjectivities and political agency. We started meeting over a year ago, and we were brought together by a sort of shared interest in an expanded notion of horror. So when we talk about horror, we're not really so much talking about genre, although that figures in my work, in my filmic work, but really more about the horizons of horror, as we called them in the subtitle, and how they figure and are figured in literary, social, aesthetic, feminist, and psychoanalytical theory. We felt that there is a real urgency to this engagement with horror, which arises in the face of this kind of economically, politically, socially, and ecologically horrific times. And we believe that somehow through horror we could begin to speak about our times. And I think what we really felt really strongly is that, you know, as being a mix of practitioners, writers, theorists, we really felt like in order to do so, we sort of somehow needed to transgress like disciplinary boundaries and also kind of enter areas that are more like, you know, like part of a conversation or more within the experience also of being here together, sort of transgress boundaries and make new alliances, which is why we brought together all the speakers, which have really quite different approaches and come from different perspectives in ways that would bring together practice, theory, and lived experience to bear upon each other. And since horror has become quite fashionable lately and is also such an important part of our thinking and making and indeed being, we also felt an urgency to bring together speakers that could shed light on it from a perspective where horror does not ultimately signal kind of apocalypse or nihilism, but also a kind of an affirmation of being amongst others and the transformative horizon.
I guess in a way the things that brought us together really is an attitude, and it's a kind of attitude that acknowledges a feeling of precarity and the instability that become our norms. It acknowledges a world where limits are constantly being exceeded, redrawn, and abandoned, inviting us to question the ways we map the world. But though our world has become a place of horrors, that it produces monsters that seem to be portents of some looming doom. Monster from the word montre, to show. I think in medieval times, if you had a strange birth or an animal with two heads, it was a portent of something. So the monstrous is a sign. We feel the horror is also an attitude towards the limit. We feel the horror is proper to any attempt to navigate these limitrope territories. As one loses one's references and one's navigating stars, at the edge of the known world, everything is transfigured. We're plunged into this terrifying opportunity to refigure ourselves. The opportunity takes the form of a night without stars, a disaster. We remove the stars. And where we must challenge and overcome the official and public discourses increasingly mediated through the spectacular and reactionary polarizations, the dangerous divisions by which they proceed, and the deadly ends into which they are often force thought, feeling, and action as a result. We find it harder to produce the critical distance nowadays that allows us to transcend the mechanisms of any problem we encounter, and more need to contend with being embedded in the problematics that alter as we attempt to react to them. Rather than leading us to give up on our capacity to reason, we feel that the need to push this capacity further. It requires us to refigure the apparatus, to transgress and reconfigure alliances and boundaries that we construct our polarities with. Who will be born from this night without stars, and whom or what will carry us through? The requirement of thinking in this matrix or a mesh context has led us to want to transplant, however minimally, this discussion from the academic roots into the perhaps more weakly structured space of art practice, of doing art. The space that we feel can accommodate the weaving together and across of disciplinary rounds that can sustain their differences and contradictions positively. Yes, this conference is for artists and art, but both as a dissemination of ideas, but also as a place perhaps already pregnant with the possibilities that we're seeing emerging. This horror is a vital pole in repositioning and refashioning ourselves, not just the way of describing a situation. From its descriptive force, we hoped to move to a figuration, I don't know if that's the right word, that is capable of changing our capacity to carry each other. Through technology, gender, and each other, we propose that this ontological and epistemological question or attitude is also inseparably an ethical question. The self as a ground for thinking is undermined, and otherness and other responsibility to it put first, the ethical subject being responsible to one another.
To answer the questions we put in front of ourselves, we invited speakers, Bracha Ettinger, Anselm Franke, Diane Bauer, and Helen Hester. And I wanted to say something about why and what kind of perspective we think they bring in. At the movement we made from starting with a genre of horror, moving to the broader experience of horror in everyday life in our contemporary society. And I hope they will help us to shed light on these. Bracha Ettinger is an artist and psychoanalyst. She, I hope, will help us to understand how much feelings of anxiety and horror are bound up with our personal biography and our history as subjects. So the way we are becoming subject includes anxiety, includes feelings of horror, and we hope we will be able to ask her how far the horizons of horror can be pushed further in order to use the feeling of horror or the feeling of anxiety as an emancipatory tool for navigating the contemporary world. Anselm Franke is a curator. He is head of art and film at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin. He brings in a cultural and historical perspective. Some years ago, he did an exhibition on animism, which is the way a modern subject describes what non-Western subjects do when they animate objects or think of nature or natural entities having a soul or spirit. Of course, outside the Western world, nothing like this projection ever existed. However, it makes up a ghostly quality for the European subject to encounter animations or animated objects. What he is interested in is how these projections shed a light back on us and, for instance, come back in the museum object that is usually animated or an animated object. So I hope with the help of his cultural and historical perspective that looks on animism, that is something we encounter in horror constantly, will help us to make a kind of a difference between modern times and 20th century horrors and contemporary situations of horror. And finally, we invited Helen Hester and Diane Bauer, who are members of the xeno-feminist collective Laboria Cubonics. And what we were impressed by is how the xeno-feminist collective embraces technology and tries to use the anxiety of horror of technology in an emancipatory way, calling for something like an ethics of nature that is not just going back to nature, but if nature is unjust, change it. Something that again induces massive feelings of horror and anxiety. Melanie Bonayo will give a performance lecture. She collected images of animals over the past years in the internet to question whether this private use and private, usually animation of animals, humanizing of animals, requires a new scientific approach to the image of the animal. One of the aims is also to establish a dialogue between, an academic approach, making concepts, think through the experiences of horror, and seeing works of art that are in dialogue with that, especially in workshops. So all the speakers, Bracha Ettinger, Anselm Franke, Diane, and Helen will also hold workshops after their talks. Mine, because I will not give a talk, will be about a film script by a Russian theorist of literature, Viktor Shklovsky, who wrote a film script that is unpublished and is never made it to become a film, that is called Horror, and deals with psychophysiological experiments in the 1920s on the human soul, on human behavior, to create something like the new post-revolutionary man. At the end of our symposium, I hope we can have a discussion together again. We called it The Final Girl, taking up the motive of horror films where, you know, after day by day one person dies, and at the end of it there's only one survivor, the final girl. So that will be our final panel, and I hope we will have a discussion to bring it all together, which I will not do now.